What is up, everybody? Welcome back into another episode of the Two Stripes Podcast, the college football podcast for you, the college football fan. My name is Colton Denning, and I'm coming to you from Boulder, Colorado on Friday, May 5th, 2017. Hope all of you had an excellent week and you're ready for the weekend. Excited to get into the podcast today, but before I do that, you may have noticed a new intro, courtesy of my brother Tyler. It's a little funky. I like it. It switches up the pace a little bit. So shout out to my brother for giving me some new fuego to play here on the podcast. And if you want to hear any of his beats that he creates, you can go to his SoundCloud page, soundcloud.com/TashDenn. That's TashDenn, and you can hear everything he's been cooking up down in Austin, Texas. Also, if you want to check out any episodes of the Two Stripes podcast, any of the old stuff we've done over the off season, you can do so by going to soundcloud.com/TwoStripesPod or by searching Two Stripes Podcast on iTunes. You can subscribe there, leave a review, leave a comment. All of that is greatly appreciated. If you like the podcast, please let me know. If you don't like the podcast and want to leave comments or suggestions, then feel free to do so. Leave a review there. Also, you can follow me on Twitter or leave me any comments on Twitter at Dubsco. That's DUBSCO. Let's get into this episode, though. So yesterday, I spoke with Marc Weiszer. He is the Georgia beat writer for the Athens Banner Herald and OnlineAthens.com about everything Georgia football. We broke down kind of where the Bulldogs sit in the SEC East, why they haven't been able to get over that hump and get back to the SEC title game since 2012, despite all the talent that they've had and seemingly being a better team than Florida and Tennessee and other teams in the East, but they just haven't been able to put it together. And of course, Florida's won the East back-to-back years in Jim McElwain's first two seasons. But now, Kirby Smart on the job at Georgia. Mark talked a little bit about his first season, whether it met expectations, and kind of where to set the barometer for year two. And, of course, broke down everything with the Bulldogs' offense and defense and whether or not they should be SEC East favorites in 2017. So let's get right into it. Here is Marc Weiszer talking Georgia football. Joining me now to talk all things Georgia football and Georgia spring ball in the 2017 offseason headed into the season is Marc Weiszer. He is the Georgia beat writer for the Athens Banner Herald and OnlineAthens.com. Mark, how you doing today?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Ready to talk Georgia football. It was a very interesting season for Georgia last year. They go 8-5, 4-4 in the SEC in head coach Kirby Smart's first season. Looking back on 2016 real quick, how would you assess Georgia's season? There was a lot of crazy things that happened. I think that maybe for the average fan, the Tennessee game stands out. The way the regular season ended against Georgia Tech on a sour note stands out before they win the bowl game and go 8-5. But how would you assess Kirby Smart's first season on the job?
You know, he brought some enthusiasm in terms of the recruiting class, momentum around the program. Anytime there's a new coach, guy that was very successful as an Alabama defensive coordinator, an alum from Georgia. I mean, the school went after him as a defensive coordinator. A couple had openings under Mark Richt's staff. So, you know, after 15 years of Mark Richt, I think a certain segment of the fan base was ready for a change. Not everybody, but, wanting to get the program back to Atlanta. And this wasn't the type of year that would get them there. There were, some growing pains. You had a freshman starting quarterback in Jacob Eason, and you mentioned the Tennessee game. That was one of many close games for Georgia, and too many for Georgia fans on the wrong side. Losing at home to Vanderbilt on homecoming is not something that ever sits well. And then losing to your rival Georgia Tech at a game you should have won probably as well. Those things kind of stand out. It started well with an impressive win against North Carolina, in a pretty hyped game in the Georgia Dome. Ended well against TCU in the Liberty Bowl, but overall 8-5. People are hoping for much better this year.
Just in 1 year on the job, what would you say are the two, or not the two biggest differences, but what are a couple of the biggest differences between the way that Kirby Smart runs the program to the way that Mark Richt ran the program?
Kirby's definitely a Nick Saban disciple, and a lot of Alabama things he brought here, whether the way he structured his practices, dealt with the media. I mean, even small things like moving his news conference from Tuesday, which Mark Richt had, to Monday. A lot of things that Nick does at Alabama, Kirby wanted to replicate, and it makes sense. I mean, he was part of a successful championship program, won several national championships at Alabama. I would say also Kirby he was hired at the age of 40, which Mark Richt was too. So maybe he has a little more fire in the belly at this stage, and Mark Richt might have regained that when he went down to Miami, getting more hands-on again. So you definitely saw Kirby very involved with the defense. It's Mel Tucker's defense, but Kirby Smart's defensive pedigree, you saw him just in individual drills and stuff at practice, really coaching up guys, where maybe Mark Richt was, I guess, at the stage of the career he was at Georgia, he was more of a CEO type coach.
I want to get into the defense here in a second, but one thing that really stood out to me in watching Georgia and looking at some of their stats from last year was how poor the offense was. And quarterback Jacob Eason came in as a very highly touted prospect and was kind of thrown into the fire as a freshman. And it wasn't great, wasn't awful. You could certainly do worse for your first year playing in the SEC. But Georgia really struggled in a lot of facets offensively last season, and one of those was finishing drives. And what have you seen so far from Eason this offseason, and what's his next step in developing into kind of being a top-tier quarterback in the SEC in his sophomore season?
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. Not a horrible season, but not the kind of season you expect necessarily for a five-star quarterback. I mean, ideally, you'd like to have a situation where he wouldn't have to start as a true freshman. But in this day and age, the clock is going. If this is a guy with NFL potential, and Georgia's quarterback situation was such that they had a graduate transfer incumbent starting quarterback, Grayson Lambert, that could only hold off Eason for one game. So, Eason, 55% completion percentage. He had some very impressive games driving Georgia down to win at Missouri late. Same thing at Kentucky, set up a game-winning field goal. But then you go to South Carolina and you throw for less than 100 yards. Part of the problem was he had an offensive line that kind of underperformed. They had three senior starters. And, especially in the run game, Georgia, with Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, they didn't run like you might expect they should. So that put a lot of pressure on Eason to make plays on the outside. You lost Malcolm Mitchell, who, won a Super Bowl with the Patriots. Georgia managed to make Isaiah McKenzie their go-to guy as a, 5'8" slot receiver, 5'7" slot receiver. And, but Georgia's offense hasn't been the same since Mike Bobo left for Colorado State. They had Brian Schottenheimer for 1 year. And, pretty much similar results to what they had under Jim Chaney in year one. So it's been an offseason where they've looked at, what can we do to get better in a lot of areas on offense. Red zone offense was one area in particular that you mentioned that they struggled there. I think what Georgia's doing now is they're looking for ways to utilize their playmakers. You're seeing Sony Michel getting pushed out into the slot as a wide out, even Nick Chubb out of the backfield. They've moved Mecole Hardman, one of their talented players who was a backup cornerback, was the number one athlete coming out of high school in some rankings. He's moved from cornerback to wide receiver. So they're looking to many different avenues to try to become more explosive offensively.
You mentioned Mecole Hardman, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, some of the skill talent that Georgia has. And that's why, at least like looking in from the outside in, it's baffling that Georgia struggled so much. But when you dive deeper, it looks like they've had some real struggles, especially last season, on the offensive line. And it looked like that continued in Georgia's G-Day game, giving up 5 sacks and not getting a ton of push in the run game either. What's the outlook for Georgia's offensive line in 2017, and what are the odds that a couple of those 5 offensive linemen that they signed in the 2017 class are counted on right away to make an impact for them?
The story of the spring was actually the improvement of the offensive line. Now, G-Day, that didn't show up. You had the number one offense against the number one defense, and there were 5 sacks in that game, as you mentioned. But in general, I think there's a lot more optimism about how this group can do. The first 2 scrimmages was much better for the offensive line. They lost 3 starters, but none of those 3 guys were drafted. They all ended up signing free agent deals. We're talking about Brandon Cublano, the center, Tyler Catalina, the graduate transfer, left tackle, and Greg Pike, a guy that played at both tackle and guard, in his Georgia career. They seem to have solidified some things. Isaiah Wynn is their left tackle now. Their center is Lamont Galliard, who was a guard last year. And they have a guy, Solomon Kinley, who's 340-ish pounds, who's looking like another starter at a guard position. Isaiah Wilson's got a chance to come in. He's the big five-star offensive tackle from Brooklyn. Maybe he makes a run at the right tackle spot. We'll see. But Georgia, Pat Allen was a guy that was a redshirt sophomore. He's kind of been plugged in as a left guard, and people like what he's done. So they feel better about things. They did get more push in the run game this spring. We'll see if it can play out the same way when the season rolls around. But I think you do have a chance for another guy like Andrew Thomas coming in from the Atlanta area. These are big-time, bigger offensive linemen that Sam Pittman wants in his program, and these guys are recruited to upgrade the offensive line. I think they're going to have a chance eventually, and maybe 2 or 3 of these guys might get some playing time right away.
Earlier, you brought up both Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, and both those guys decided to come back for their senior seasons this year. And with Jacob Eason going into his second year, the offensive line you're talking about that's kind of in flux, how much do you expect the offense to kind of go through those two guys as they make their last run at trying to get to Atlanta?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you would think that would be the case. If they can run the ball like they did against TCU in the second half, where the first half they were pretty much stuffed, but they really wore down an undersized defense in that game, and really the floodgates just opened, and Georgia ended up, winning pretty comfortably in that game. Nick Chubb and Sony Michel got very little work at all, and neither of them got a carry in the spring game. These guys are being groomed and ready to go in the fall to be able to be healthy and, be able to be out there as much as they can this season. Both these guys have had injury-riddled careers. Chubb with his knee. Sony Michel had a shoulder deal last preseason that kind of went into last season. But, you do have a sophomore quarterback in Jacob Eason that's supposed to be able to make some plays downfield, and Georgia has reason to be optimistic about the wide receivers based on what they did in G-Day, and Kirby Smart said it was the best of their 15 spring practices, these wide receivers. But Terry Godwin has been praised by Kirby Smart. He had a pretty impressive freshman season and kind of faded a little bit last year, but he's pretty much bought into being a physical wide receiver, which Kirby Smart wants his guys to be. Javon Williams can make plays downfield. He's a junior college transfer that made some plays last year, not enough. And then Brian Herrion's another one of those guys, the running back that you can see move into the slot. Can also lighten the load if you want it from Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. But they also have tight ends, Charlie Warner, Isaac Nauta. They have weapons. It's a matter of Cheney utilizing them probably much better than he did last season.
I want to get into Isaac Nauta. He was a kid that had a strong freshman season. He was a very highly touted recruit. I want to say he was committed to Florida State for a long time before ending up at Georgia, and he had a really productive freshman season. Do you think, and we hear all the time how important a tight end is, or a tight end is a quarterback's best friend. Do you think that Nauta can be a key to Jacob Eason's development?
Well, he already was, probably a bigger target than maybe Georgia wanted. I mean, in terms of Eason and his progressions, Nauta had 29 catches last year, third on the team. And, I'm not sure that was always the best option, but I see no reason why Eason to Nauta will not be continuing for the next couple of years. I mean, Nauta is an ideal, guy to put on the outside and make plays matched up with linebackers, slot star type nickel backs, that kind of thing. So he's a weapon. He's got probably pro potential as well. But, Georgia's always, it seems like the last couple of years, we're always talking about how Georgia's going to utilize their tight ends. And a lot of games they really don't. So last year they were using them a lot in 2 tight end sets just to block to help out to the offensive line that was needed all the help they can get. So, but I do think Isaac Nauta will continue to be a big weapon for Eason.
Flipping over to the defense, Georgia brings back 85% of their production from last season. That's 5th nationally from a talented, but I wouldn't say great defense, but a good defense in 2016. What do you think that the calling card is going to be for this defense in 2017 now that they're in Kirby Smart's second season? All those guys are veteran guys for the most part, and they've had a year to kind of digest what he wants to do as they move into year 2.
I'm not sure what would be the calling card. I mean, I think you can make an argument about, is it your outside linebackers, with Davin Bellamy and Lorenzo Carter, who could both be gone before the, in the first 2 days of the NFL draft. Next year, is it going to be Trenton Thompson coming back? And you might want to talk about his deal this spring where he wasn't with the team on the practice field, but he's probably their best defensive player, a guy that can get in the backfield, who just had a dominant game in the Liberty Bowl. Then you have an experienced secondary with Dominic Sanders Aaron Davis, Malcolm Parrish. You have guys that have been around the block in the system, and then you have their leading tackler, Roquan Smith, last year, who breakout year last year for him, very talented as well. They don't always show up every time out. Their red zone defense in particular was atrocious last year, and that's been an area they've been working on. But they certainly have a lot of talent, a lot of experience back there. It might depend on the matchups of which game, these guys are going to, which one of those units is going to be the best.
You brought up Trenton Thompson, and he hasn't been practicing with the team this spring. But outside of him last year on that defensive line, UGA had one of the weakest defensive lines at creating havoc plays in the country. So heading into 2017, what are some of the names to look out for, and how much of a concern is it that this defensive line can't get penetration, can't get tackles for loss or sacks, especially if Trenton Thompson's situation is still in flux?
Yeah, tackles for loss was Kirby Smart's. I guess I mentioned red zone defense, but tackles for loss he's probably been talking about more, in that's the area he wants Georgia to be much better at. The coaching staff went to visit Oklahoma, maybe even Clemson. I can't remember the other team, but they went to some of the best defenses, people that they had coaching relationships with, talk about, how they can improve there schematically. Thompson's the guy that can do it. They also have a guy like Jonathan Ledbetter, who missed the first half of last season after a couple alcohol-related incidents and, had to be suspended for half the season on Georgia's policy. But he's a guy that had a very good spring and, has gotten stronger, has refashioned his body in the weight room, and looks like an impressive specimen. So he's got the potential to do that. They didn't really have much on the recruiting, circles to upgrade there, but they already had a lot of young talent that, they hope can take the next step. Julian Rochester is a guy that was, I think was a 4-star coming out of, Atlanta last year. And they have other guys as well, David Marshall. John Atkins is a veteran guy. So they have bodies. It's a matter of Georgia. I think Ledbetter is the guy in particular that can take that next step up and kind of tag team, be a tackle for loss guy like Trenton Thompson.
You talked about the linebackers and how basically everybody's coming back, and there's Lorenzo and Reggie Carter, Natrez Patrick, Roquan Smith, and Davin Bellamy. Is it fair to say that as they go, this defense will go in 2017?
Yeah, I don't want to pin it on just them, but Lorenzo Carter in particular is a guy that was a huge 5-star guy. Remember, Carter was a guy that was a big get in one of Mark Richt's final recruiting classes, and showed up pretty well his freshman year. His sophomore year, he didn't have a single sack, and was kind of a head scratcher how a guy that was as talented and looked the part could kind of disappear. And last year came out better, 5 sacks, one of the better pass rushers on the team. But he needs to be a guy that's an all-SEC caliber. But, we talk about the talent and the experience on this team. Georgia didn't have an all-SEC selection at all last year. So, these guys need to kind of live up to their recruiting billing. They need to be developed by this coaching staff. And Carter's a guy in particular that, still has kind of scratched the surface and could be he could take it up another level.
That star position is probably the most talked about position, whether it's on the Alabama defense or with the Georgia defense now with Kirby Smart. It seems like it gets a ton of pub because that's a guy that needs to be versatile and do a ton of things. And last year's player, which was a grad transfer from Alabama to Georgia, Maurice Smith, goes on to the NFL. Are there any names to look for that Georgia is looking to replace Maurice Smith, because he was such a key component to that defense, and who has kind of stood out so far at that position in spring ball?
Yeah, Maurice Smith comes in. He gets cleared by the SEC to be a graduate transfer after Nick Saban, pretty much put a stop sign to it at Alabama. Didn't want him to go to Georgia, and he got through the red tape of that with the SEC. It shows up here the second week, I believe it was, of preseason practice, and wins the starting job immediately. And, one of the 4 team captains at the end of the year, very productive guy that knew the system that Kirby Smart and Mel Tucker ran at Bama. So this year it's kind of a big, obviously it's the only real competition for a starting spot in terms of a vacant spot. It's the only vacant spot that they have. But Tyreek McGee is a sophomore, kind of not the ideal size for that position for what Georgia wants, but a guy that, has performed well. You have Deangelo Gibbs, who was a well-regarded 4-star recruit, came in as an early enrollee, and he's been working there, competing there. He had a shoulder injury that kind of set him back at the end of spring practice. And then Aaron Davis is kind of a jack of all trades in the secondary. He's been working as well at the star position. He's been a safety. He's been a cornerback. So if they have a situation where they feel like the best combination is to stick Aaron Davis out there. They have J.R. Reed, who is a transfer from Tulsa that showed a lot of athleticism and big tackler as well this spring. They could start J.R. Reed at one of the safety spots and have Davis there. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out, but it's three guys pretty much competing at that spot now.
Sticking in the secondary, Kirby Smart this spring has talked about how much he loves coaching freshman safety Richard LeCount, and he was a guy that came in as another very highly touted prospect. What do you think he's going to be able to do in his freshman season, and how much do you expect him to see the field?
I think he's certainly going to see the field on special teams. The circumstances such that Georgia has so much experience there. I'm not sure exactly how much you're going to see LeCount, playing significant snaps in the secondary. I mean, maybe he overtakes one of the other guys. Dominic Sanders has been dealing with some injuries. He didn't play in the G-Day game, although he was listed as making a tackle. So I don't think he actually got on the field, but he had a knee injury as well this spring. So, and Sanders was playing hurt last year. So if it's a guy that can, get plugged in somewhere and help out, with injuries, I don't know. He's going to be a starter in this secondary sooner or later. It had a lot of tackles in the G-Day game, but as Kirby Smart said, that's not necessarily a good thing. You don't necessarily want the last line of defense to be that active in his system. But a very talented guy, has a lot of energy towards the ball, gets after it. I just don't know at this point whether the guys in front of him are going to make way for him.
So Georgia hasn't won the SEC East since 2012, which is crazy because it always seems like there's a step away, and whether it's a misstep against Florida and Jacksonville or another late season loss, it always seems like something derails them. Now with how the East is once again seemingly in flux, Tennessee, maybe their chance was last year and they're not going to have the same team this season. Florida, they're going to have an offense this year again, but they're going for their third straight SEC East title. Despite that, Georgia has to be the favorites in the SEC East, right? At least on paper. Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely the darling of the media for this offseason as the team that's going to win the East. Now, you said that Georgia didn't win the SEC in 2012, although they came 5 yards away in, a weird deal with it where they didn't spike the ball and somebody caught it and time ran out on them. But it's been 2005 since they won it. They went back-to-back in 11 and 12, and, to see Missouri come into the conference and get there, see Florida do it back-to-back with a first and second-year coach. Georgia certainly, the fan base is crazy wanting them to get there. And on paper, it looks like they have the talent to do that. I mean, I haven't made a decision how I'm going to vote for SEC Media Days. If I'm going to pick Georgia or pick Florida, I need to study Florida's roster situation. I know they lost a lot of talent on defense as well. Georgia's been picked before, made it sometimes, haven't made it other times. They need to win games that they should. On paper, maybe Georgia's a team, but this is a program that has found ways not to get to Atlanta too often. So it looks like it, with what they have coming back with 6 guys passing on the NFL draft, if you want to include Aaron Davis in there as well, underclassmen that are now seniors. Georgia has, and add to that this top 3 recruiting class. It's going to be a matter of the offense, the offensive line, Jacob Eason's development. I think those are the big question marks, and also Kirby Smart as a coach. It's year 2, and being better on game day to make the close games swing Georgia's way.
So with all that in mind, what do you think a fair expectation is for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2017?
And when you say expectation, I mean, I think, winning the SEC East, is it fair to say that they should win it? No, I think it is fair. I mean, Georgia needs to win the SEC East given the environment in that division now. Whether that makes them the 3rd or 4th best team in the SEC, I don't know, but I don't know if they're necessarily going to do it. I think it's fair for Georgia fans to want to win the SEC East, to think that they should win it. And, if they go 10-2 and don't win the East, I don't know if that's necessarily feasible, but that would be better than going 8-5 and going to the Liberty Bowl. So, I don't think you want to judge it necessarily on only winning the SEC East. I think you want to be a better program and, have a lot more optimism heading into the next year.
Well, it should be another crazy year for Georgia football and the SEC East. I know I can't wait to check out Kirby Smart's second year and see how that team performs, especially on offense. And if you want to follow any of what's going on with Georgia football, I would recommend that you follow Marc Weiszer and his coverage online, and you can do so by going to the Athens Banner Herald and also finding him at onlineathens.com. And then you can follow him on Twitter as well, at Marc Weiszer. That's MarcWeiszer. Mark, thank you for joining the show and dropping some knowledge on Georgia football.
No problem. Great to be with you.
There you have it. Should be a very important year for Georgia football. Seemingly, once again, like we said, this is their year in the SEC East, it would seem like. Like they are the best team. I think they have the most talent. This 2017 recruiting class should get a bunch of guys into, if not the starting lineup, then definite strong playing time. And I think guys like Richard LeCount should be able to make a difference on that team and push them over the top to get to Atlanta. Obviously, don't think that they're quite the quality of a team like Alabama once they get to Atlanta, but I do think that winning the SEC East is a very realistic goal for them and should be the expectation. And, of course, they need to take care of business in Jacksonville against Florida and not be tripped up against other teams in the East. But right now, I do think that Georgia's the best team in that division. So should be fun for that to play out and see whether Georgia can clear those hurdles in Kirby Smart's second season on the job. Want to thank Marc Weiszer for joining the show again. And if you want to catch any of his work, you can do so by going to the Athens Banner Herald and also visiting onlineathens.com. Find all of his writing there. And then you can follow him on Twitter at Marc Weiszer. That's MarcWeiszer. That's going to wrap it up for this week's show. Want to thank everybody who listened. If you're a new listener and you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, tell me what you liked, tell me what you think that I need to work on to make this show better for you, and so we can get through this offseason as we head towards the 2017 college football season. If you want to find any of the old shows, do so by going to soundcloud.com/twostripespod or by going to iTunes and searching Two Stripes Podcast. And then follow me on Twitter as well if you'd like to, at Dubsco. That's DUBSCO. And you can reach me there. I'm not a hard guy to find or to interact with. So I'd love to hear from you guys if you enjoy the show. That's going to wrap it up, though. Hope everybody has a great and safe weekend. I'll be back next week with at least one more episode. But until then, my name is Colton Denning, and this has been the Two Stripes Podcast.